Hi, and welcome to Game Masters Hall. I'm Sam Leve, and with me here today is Amy Dallen as we talk about homebrew content. Hey Amy, so we've done a little bit of homebrew stuff. What's your experience with homebrews?
I love this question, but first, before we can get into it, I'd love to just be like, what do we mean when we say homebrew?
There's this whole spectrum of it, right? From an ad hoc house rule all the way to basically building a game system within a game system. We see those a lot. There's all of the classes in Homebrew D&D. Those are homebrew.
Yeah, are you eventually building rules for Magball in Callisto 6?
No. Yes, that's a thing. I was thinking about it this week.
But essentially, I don't think I've ever played in a game that didn't have some component of house ruling, which is sort of, I've always interpreted, like you said, ad hoc, as the kind of a minor change that is distinct to this group and this play experience, and occasionally one will become sort of widespread and infect other game groups and maybe even have an influence on later iterations of games or on people. Game designers, I think, often draw from like the house rules they've loved the most to figure out what feels right in play. But I feel like the basic rules for them just, in my experience, have to be something that makes sense to everyone at the table, that suits the style of play at that table, but that doesn't break the game.
So when does a house rule feel seamless to you?
For me, usually when I literally forget it's not in the book. Which is a point, as like the book kid, that does happen where I'm like, no, that's definitely on page nothing. We just do that. This is maybe something we've done a lot on Weave, the rules light storytelling game that we often play. But there are things where I'm like, we've just been doing it for so long, I have forgotten that is not rules as written because it's so seamless with our play style and with our world. Now, I don't recommend forgetting which rules are in the book. That's not a great long-term strategy. But it is, that's sort of the clear mark for me that it literally seamless. You can't tell where one ends and the new piece begins. What about you?
I love the idea of house ruling within rules lights because we think of house rule so often in what we'll call crunchier games, right, where we might feel the need to streamline for the particulars of our table. But when you start with a rules light game like Weave, house ruling feels almost like it would have more impact because you're altering a fairly finite small set.
That absolutely is the case, yeah. And the small tweaks too. In that case, the house rules tend to be as much about sort of tweaking the way that you apply a general move and just sort of finding out what works for you over time. And we have, like, we use play sets for Weave that give us these settings, but we're always sort of half home creating the settings to go with them, adding, of course, in our own characters and situations to the ones that we get from the story prompts. So we get a lot of sort of practice in being like, how much do we want this to apply? And, you know, the golden rule is just, is it working at the table and is everyone having fun?
Yeah. So what would you recommend to people when maybe a house rule is working for some people, but not everyone feels the same at a table?
That's a great question. I don't know. What are your first thoughts there?
I mean,
when it's working for some people at the table and not others, I think you have to sort of figure out why and what the manner of the not working for. Like, if one person finds it very engaging and someone is, like, just not as interested in that part of it, then that's not a sort of, that's like a less serious example of that conflict. If there's a house rule that, like, that some people are really loving, but that make other people feel like they've lost the understanding, like it makes them start to be like, now I don't understand how the rules work. Then that can be frustrating because they feel like they're operating at a disadvantage in terms of like, well, then what is possible? You know, and I get that kind of frustration can lead to, like, it makes you less excited to make choices. And so I don't know, like, in terms of resolving those, I think you probably just have to iterate on the rule, right? Until you find some version that's sort of meeting close enough to everybody's needs. What do you think?
That sounds fair and hits multiply on the fundament of all of this with balancing and playtesting and homebrewing, which is how does it feel?
Yeah.
Because you can make spreadsheets forever. You can check your dice equations for 100 years.
Go on.
And they can feel completely wrong. no matter what the mathematical balance is, we're trying to evoke sentiment from these games. And these rules are meant to accomplish an end. They're not an end in themselves. Rules are an instrument to blank.
Right.
So what is your homebrew, what is your house rule trying to do? When we're looking at Callisto 6 as a whole setting, what is the setting trying to do in the sense of reinforcing theme and laying the ground for story? So if I know my GM very well and has a beautiful talent for description, you might give them a virtual reality environment where they would constantly be describing and playing to their strengths. That one of the big advantages of homebrew is that you can absolutely super customize it until it feels right and feels great for the table and shows off the virtues of the specific people. And so if, for instance, someone were designing a sport like Magball, they might design it to a very jockey sport kind of person and their interests. And then might solicit input from that person and how it feels to them.
No, that's fascinating because I want to hop all over from like individual house rules to enormous setting creation, because the big shifts, specifically in Callisto, taking rules that function very well for Magic and figuring out how they work when you put a superhero skin on it. There's some great guidance in the book for, but so much Eric has had to make up and you have had to help make up. And we've sort of been figuring out together in terms of what feels the most satisfying for the story that we're telling and for the challenges we're facing. What have you not taken on yet in terms of a building challenge that you would be excited to do?
So I'm building a ship combat system.
Oh my goodness. So we're talking naval ships, starships, or both?
Starships mostly. 3D combat's great. But I think it's because you and I have played a ton in space. You are famously in charge of space. And
for a certain value of famous, which is you insisting that I'm in charge of space.
Famous for being in charge of space.
Okay.
So when we've been across all of those different games, we've seen how many different games have done ship combat. And so you get a vocabulary to riff upon, and you get the sense of, well, I liked this from this, I didn't like it from this. And so if you're, for instance, a systems kid who's read a ton of books, what you, Amy, have gotten is a vocabulary of game design language. And so when you feel a need for something different or something better, all of those games you've read are now going to come into play, because even on a subconscious level, even on just telling you what you do and don't like about those games,
sure,
you've learned and you've applied. And what do you want to homebrew with all of that knowledge, Amy Dallen?
That's a great question. I haven't thought in terms of sort of going beyond, like, I haven't done much in terms of creating my own mechanics. I've gained a facility that I'm really enjoying with sort of the virtues of applying them differently in different situations, especially on TBD and in other situations like that, and like lasers and feelings, where you take very simple mechanics and then figure out how they can play out like that. It's an astonishingly versatile game, as both of us know from different show experience and home games. But right now, that's mostly what I'm enjoying, is just practicing the application of it, especially as like relatively a baby GM compared to my player experience, and just figuring out the invisible mastery of like, okay, which rule when, which ruling when, which intervention when, and that's where most of my focus has been on. But like world from scratch, system from scratch, that's brass ring territory. That sounds fun as heck.
The great thing is that all of those little steps are such great fundamentals. I think when people talk about game design, it's so intimidating that it seems like what game design is I have to come up with a whole world. I have to come up with a whole new set of rules. No one's ever seen these rules before. They're nothing like any other rules. They have to be entirely original. And that much pressure for such an ambitious project could be so paralyzing. But what you've been doing as part of house ruling and homebrewing and reading and experiencing are all pieces of game design that...
Tricking yourself into doing the thing. I see. Big things. Clarity-inducing conversations. And it is interesting because to sort of test out the feeling of adding your own element while also like honoring the incredibly hard work that goes into like giving people a rules as written starting point is I've never thought about it as sort of getting your feet wet in terms of game design, but that's absolutely what it is.
It's all just stepping stones of the same thing. When a game designer might make a game, they might just have dry mechanics and slap any old flavor onto it, or they might do the reverse. And so what we do as homebrewers that happens, as you say, at every table does train us to at least think in terms of game design, and that can make us better players and better GMs.
How do you know when something's working?
I know something is working when it is consistently eliciting the effect that I want it to have. And ideally not also negative unintended effects in table feel, because both of those are important.
And that's the biggest danger of house rules is the negative unintended effect where you're like, did not occur to me that would make this math take 6 times as long because it sounded really cool, you know.
It sounded so cool at the time, and I think that's the importance of templating when approaching homebrew, that those damage type reflavors that have a couple other knock-on rules, you check against other spells that are like that or against similar abilities. And what that lets us do is piggyback off of all of the balancing and playtesting that the game designer did.
Yay.
If you have a spell that looks roughly similar, but only alters a few things, for the most part, it's probably going to work roughly like that thing that the game designer poured so much time and effort into. And ideally, if we're doing it right, has that seamless idiomatic feel so that you don't remember that those rules weren't in there.
Absolutely.
Well, now that we've solved homebrewing content for RPGs, let's check in with Xander, who's with Emily of Level Up Dice.
Thanks, Sam. Hey, Emily.
Hi.
What do you have for me today?
Today, I would like to talk to you about the randomness of dice.
Potato.
That was quite random.
Thank
Very
you.
good.
Uh-huh.
You're learning.
Okay.
So I get asked all the time,
Sure.
Emily, can you sell me weighted dice?
That was a private conversation that we had.
I'm calling
off
you
camera.
out.
Dang it.
The thing is, if you really want your dice to assist you in your storytelling, they have to be as random as possible.
Sure.
That way we've got the ones to balance out the 20s, right?
Good storytelling.
So the truth of the matter is, a perfectly balanced, perfectly weighted set of dice is going to give you really random rolls, but it's not the only factor in determining the most randomness possible for your rolls.
Okay.
Number one is going to be a perfectly weighted set of dice. When we're able to manufacture the dice so that they're perfectly weighted on the center of gravity balance, you can ensure that you're getting the most random occurrence of each side as you roll.
Sure.
Number two is human influence.
What did you look at me for?
So, believe it or not, over time, if you have a perfectly weighted die, you could literally train yourself to roll not 100% of the time, but close to it of the same number over and over again. So you can
that's why you
literally
looked at
get
me.
those nat 20s over and over.
Yeah.
I've seen it happen.
Oh, not with me though.
But if you eliminate the human involvement as much as possible,
That sounds scary.
in a totally fine, not scary way.
Okay.
That can be something as simple as having a rolling tower. For me, it's a little drastic on the dice, so
Sure.
even just kind of tossing it about in your hand is going to give you that effect as well.
Awesome.
Number three is having the dice hit multiple surfaces as you roll it. In casinos, they actually require that the dice hits 2 surfaces in order to determine that the roll is random. So that's where trays with walls come in handy. By hitting the bottom and the side of the,
20!
by hitting the bottom and the side of the tray, you can ensure that you're getting the most randomness possible. So with all 3 of those elements together, you can make sure that your storytelling is in the hands of the dice gods only.
Wow, that's fantastic. Well, thank you for keeping us honest.
My pleasure.
And be sure to check out our friends The Deck of Many at thedeckofmany.com. They have all kinds of decks built to assist GMs, freeing us from traditional reference books and allowing us to only bring the resources we need, which is super helpful. Now, Amy, you're going to be in the host seat next week. What are we going to expect from you?
Yes, I'm so excited. First, thank you for having me. That was so much fun. Second, everybody should come back next week because I get to talk about exploring and balancing the emotional spectrum in your game with the fabulous Kelly D'Angelo.
What could be more perfect? Be sure to catch it next week.